All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Look, I know exactly who's tuning in today. We've got experienced meditators, neuroscientists, clinical psychologists, and scholars of contemplative sciences. So we're going to skip the basic definitions and just cut straight to the chase. Today, we are going very, very deep into the neurobiology of how specific contemplative practices, specifically Vipassana scanning and mental noting, neuromodulate the posterior cingulate cortex. Basically, we're going to look at exactly how these interventions can actually correct default mode network dysregulation in obsessive-compulsive disorder.
So, here's our roadmap. We'll start with the triple network dysfunction, then move to the PCC as the narrative hub, followed by pathological coupling and OCD, the mechanisms of Vipassana and noting, and finally, restructuring network flexibility. We are going to unapologetically decode the network topology of this disorder.
Okay, Section 1. The triple network dysfunction.
For the longest time, OCD was viewed purely through the lens of localized cortico-striato-thalamocortical, or CSTC, circuit hyperactivity. But there's been this massive paradigm shift recently toward looking at large-scale intrinsic networks, and that really reveals the crux of the problem. What we're looking at here is a healthy brain versus an OCD brain through the lens of those massive networks: the default mode network, the salience network, and the executive control network. In a healthy profile, we see this beautiful, flexible, transient coupling. The brain seamlessly shifts between adaptive self-reflection and goal-directed tasks. But the OCD profile, it's drastically different. It's essentially a multi-system failure. The DMN and the salience network fall into this incredibly rigid, highly segregated static connectivity. They literally lose all dynamic temporal flexibility. Patients end up trapped for disproportionate amounts of time in this static brain state, and that correlates directly with high clinical anxiety and illness duration.
Moving on to Section 2, the PCC as the narrative hub.
Let's zoom in on the default mode network for a second. We absolutely have to examine its central posterior hub, the posterior cingulate cortex, or PCC. This is the anatomical core of the narrative self. Now, it's not just some monolithic structure, it's a highly parcellated region. The ventral PCC coordinates our autobiographical recollection, scene construction, and those core self-referential tasks. Meanwhile, the dorsal PCC is modulating involuntary awareness, physiological arousal, and environmental surveillance. As the primary neural substrate for self-referential cognition, the PCC is basically taking bottom-up sensory and attentional inputs and integrating them with top-down memory and concepts. And why does this matter so much for our OCD model? Because this is the exact mechanism where those abstract ego-dystonic doubts map onto vivid, terrifying self-narratives. It is literally where what if becomes I am.
Section 3, pathological coupling in OCD.
To really grasp this ego-dystonic entrapment, take a look at how directly these localized neurological hubs map onto actual clinical symptoms. Look at the left angular gyrus to the left extrastriate cortex. In an OCD state, pathological hypercoupling right here generates that highly intrusive, distress-inducing mental imagery that is just completely resistant to voluntary suppression. Then check out the connection between the PCC, the prequinus, and the left hippocampus. Elevated resting state connectivity in this specific pathway fuels that relentless rumination and the distressing recall of past outs. And finally, look at the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In OCD, we see pathological excitation of the PCC by the LDL-PFC. This exact excitation pathway correlates perfectly with severe obsessive entrapment. The brain is quite literally feeding its own anxiety loop.
Which brings us to Section 4, mechanisms of Vipassana and noting.
So the million-dollar question, how do we actually decouple this circuitry in real time? Well, we have to target a mechanism called decentering, or cognitive diffusion. And we're not talking about some abstract philosophical concept here. Cognitive diffusion is a rigorous, measurable neurological process. It's exactly what mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy actively target. It's the learned capacity to disengage the autopilot, to observe thoughts simply as transient data points, rather than literal authoritative representations of reality.
Let's break down how the practice of noting achieves this biologically. If we track a single intrusive thought, this sequence maps the subjective experience directly to the neuroanatomy. Step 1. Boom, the intrusive thought emerges. Step 2. The practitioner applies mental labeling, maybe internally saying, thinking, or worrying the exact millisecond that thought is detected. This incredibly simple volitional act of noting actively engages top-down prefrontal gating. Specifically, it recruits the left inferior frontal gyrus and the DLPFC. And then step 3, that targeted prefrontal activation directly results in the deactivation and dampening of the DMN and PCC hubs. We are taking a contemplative technique and watching it act as a clear, biological intervention that literally diffuses affect from language processing. Now, it's absolutely crucial to distinguish between different styles of meditation here. Focused attention reduces mind wandering by concentrating on specific tasks, like following the breath. Beginners usually start there, but experienced practitioners utilize open monitoring, which includes Vipassana body scanning. This involves systematically sweeping attention through the body, maintaining this non-judgmental awareness of raw somatic sensations, completely devoid of evaluation. Studies actually show that by anchoring to the physical rather than the conceptual, experienced meditators can observe their thoughts while keeping the DMN deactivated. By observing without judgment, Vipassana successfully starves the self-referential evaluation that normally hyperactivates the PCC. And get this, how long does this neuroplastic remodeling actually take? Just an 8-week structured program of MBCT or ACT has been shown to significantly alter the brain's architecture. Task-based MRI studies reveal that in just 8 weeks, we see strengthened connectivity between the left insula and the left inferior frontal gyrus. Plus, we see increased resting state functional connectivity in the PCC and precuneus. The brain is physically rewiring its relationship to anxiety.
Finally, Section 5, Restructuring Network Flexibility.
This is the big synthesis right here, looking at the long-term trait effects of contemplative practice. I really want to highlight this quote drawn from research on the default mode interference hypothesis. The crucial takeaway is that effective therapy doesn't just permanently silence or damage the DMN. I mean, that would completely impair our ability to function, right? Instead, it restructures it. When nodes of the DMN emerge to interfere with a task, control regions systematically co-activate to monitor and dampen that process. Over time, this co-activation becomes the new default mode. The DMN and the control networks literally learn to dance together, allowing the brain to systematically process and dismiss pathological intrusions.
But listen, applying this to clinical populations requires strict parameters. We absolutely have to abandon generic mindfulness apps. For an OCD patient, generic tracking tools can so easily be co-opted into compulsive checking. Instead, we need customized contemplative delivery that's tailored to network dynamics. We have to use process-oriented attentional training, like noting and Vipassana, to optimize sensory predictions and tone down those limbic threat responses. Ultimately, the entire goal is restructuring self-referential processing. We're supporting a contextual, non-rigid self-model by safely targeting the underlying neuroplastic remodeling of these network abnormalities. I want to leave you with this final thought today. If we can use precise, contemplative techniques to intentionally decouple the posterior cingulate cortex, literally allowing us to view our most terrifying, deeply personal, intrusive thoughts as mere transient data points, what does that reveal about the neurobiological illusion of the self? It challenges us to consider how harnessing network flexibility doesn't just treat obsessive-compulsive disorder, it fundamentally alters the architecture of human consciousness. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.